Hello, everybody. This is Tim Profeta, and I'm joined here with my colleague Nat Keohane, and welcome to the panel on the climate policies of the Biden administration. Unfortunately, we had another colleague who from the U.S. Congress who's supposed to join us had to cancel at the last minute because of pressing business in the U.S. Congress. So you are left with the two of us, but I think we're going to have a good and engaging conversation about the state of climate policy in the United States, particularly because in this week so much is developing. Again, my name is Tim Profeta. I'm honored to be on the board of the Climate Action Reserve. I'm also the director of the Nicholas Institute at Duke University. And relevantly for this, co-chaired a project last year called the Climate 21 Project. And that was good to be a member of our steering committee. And the project really had the aim of helping the U.S. administration 2021 take a quick and whole of government approach to the issue of climate change. So a lot of that work we might draw upon as well in this conversation. As I said, I'm joined by Nat Keohane, who is the Senior Vice President for Climate at the Environmental Defense Fund, also a veteran of the Obama White House on climate policy, as well as many other leadership roles on the climate issue. So this is a heck of a week to be having this conversation, Nat. It is Climate Leaders Week. There seems to have been an announcement in an hour for us coming out of this White House on the efforts they're going to make on climate. I think the biggest of them all, of course, was the announcement of the NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution for the United States, our pledge to the Paris Agreement on what reductions we're going to make. I won a couple beers from a friend of mine that the number was going to be over 50. The world was asking us for 50, and I felt we were psychologically going to give them like a 50x, just a little nudge. And the level is, of course, 50 to 52%. So let's first just sort of break down that NDC. What is it? What does it mean? And is it a reasonable and achievable target for the United States?
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and thanks for NACW and for Carr to organizing the panel and inviting me on. You were more prescient than I was, Tim, I think, because maybe I was a little less optimistic, and we can talk about some of that optimism and the reasons for optimism. This is a much more ambitious and bolder administration than we've ever seen, I think, before. But to set the stage, I think probably many folks in the audience will know this, but not everybody, keeps in mind what the acronyms are. So as you said, the NDC stands for Nationally Determined Contribution. And just as a reminder to folks, just over 5 years ago, the Paris Agreement was agreed by 197 parties. Almost every country in the world has since signed on. And the basic requirements of the Paris Agreement are that countries make commitments called nationally determined contributions, and then pursue efforts towards those commitments and report on how they're doing. And one of the key provisions of the Paris Agreement that all of us call the ratchet agreement, the ratchet provision, even though you won't find that word in the agreement itself, is that countries have to come back every 5 years to update and revise those NDCs, and they're expected to do so in a way that increases ambition. And so fast forward to today. Now, normally you might say, well, 5 years after 2015 was 2020. So why didn't that happen last year? Well, last year, of course, the annual climate conference was put off a year because of the COVID-19 crisis. It was delayed until the end of this year. It's currently scheduled for November in Glasgow. So what you have right now is a confluence of two things. Number one, it's the 5-year ratchet coming to bear on all the countries in the Paris Agreement that are expected to come back and update and revise their NDCs with even greater ambition. And then at the same time, of course, you have the United States, which Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement. That took effect November 4th, the day after the election. Of course, President Biden brought the U.S. back into the Paris Agreement on day one. But in doing that, he then had to come forward again with an NDC because the one that President Obama had put in place was essentially taken off the table when Trump exited. So you have the confluence of these two things, a new administration in Washington that needs to put forward a target, and then all these other countries that are actually expected to come forward and raise their ambition as well. the big, as you said, the big headline was the U.S. target. We can talk. There was some other countries we can talk about those as well for the context. But the U.S. came out with this target of 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. For context, the U.S. last year was about 20% below. Of course, that included some of the COVID impact. As I said at the start, Tim, I think you were more optimistic maybe than I was. I mean, EDF and many other groups have been leading the charge to call for at least 50% reduction. Over 400 businesses came out this week, including Ford and Walmart and GM and many others, Apple, Amazon, calling for a reduction of 50 to 52%, or at least 50%. But I was still surprised when I heard it. And I will say, actually, I'd be interested to hear your take. And maybe different. I actually think it came down to the wire. I think even this week, there was still some discussion. I know the State Department was really pushing for ambition, but they needed to balance that with making sure they felt that it was achievable and credible, something we can talk about in a minute. My sense was that it wasn't fully settled until this week, and they ended up going big and going bold, and I think that'll be a really important shot in the arm for global climate action as a result.
Yeah, I think you put your finger on it. I do think that I would agree that it was a discussion down to the wire. I do think that there is a lot of analysis that underlies it. That a lot of our good friends have been working really hard to sort of assess the levels that they think they can credibly achieve, and part of that is because the world is beyond fool me once, fool me twice. We've come and gone from the international leadership position on climate a few times now. Many people in Europe, I think, know our Senate procedures and our partisan politics better than some Americans do in terms of the risks of it. So I think the Biden administration really wanted to think it could deliver on this number and it could withstand scrutiny. And I do think it came down to the wire in terms of how far they could push. Still, I won that beer because I think just getting above that 50%, I think was trying to send a signal of ambition to the world from the country. So let's talk about how we respond.
Let me add in on that credibility piece. Yeah. I think the credibility question, even before we get to what are the policies going to be, I want to make a broader point on credibility. I run by because I think this is something that when I talk to reporters, when I talk to folks in other countries, that's the question people have. Well, what's going to make this credible? My own view is credibility in this case means that you do the math and you sort of show the math, right? And what I mean by that is this is a target that's 10 years out, 9 years out. So we shouldn't expect that every policy is in place, every regulation is in place. Obviously, all of them need to be put in place, but we shouldn't expect that every policy is in place before you set the target, because then you'd never be able to set the kind of aspirational target that drives policy rather than following it. And so what I've been saying, but my view of the test for credibility is, can you show that there are feasible pathways to get there, that you don't need a magic wand, you don't need pixie dust to get there. Mm-hmm. We did some of that modeling. We actually, I think, we're first out of the gate at EDF with our report in March saying here are 4 different models that show you can get to at least 50%. WRI did modeling, University of Maryland, Energy Innovation, NRDC, sort of everybody. I think that chorus was really important. The White House was doing the modeling itself. What we heard from the White House when we talked to them very early on was basically there was a willingness to go big. They just needed to be able to do the analysis and see the math. And so I think that was really critical. And that's, again, where I think the bar for credibility should be. It's, do you have a plausible pathway to get there, not have you nailed everything down by the time you make the announcement.
Yeah. By the way, I want to make a note here for our audience, because we're going to have, it's the two of us having this conversation. We want to invite you into the conversation as well. So at any point in this, if you have questions you want to ask of us, clarification, please put it in the chat for Hoppin, and they will forward those who are managing the broadcast will forward them to us, and we'll try and make this as live a conversation as we can in this virtual format. All right, so credibility. What does the math show? What makes this credible, Nat? What are, when you did the modeling at EDF, when others did, what are the major levers that we think we can use to actually reach these objectives, these 50 to 52%? Because that's going to be where the rubber hits the road. For those who are working in the clean tech and carbon market, that's where they're going to be looking for the opportunities for their businesses. where do we see the action happening?
Yeah, I think about four pillars, and I'll go through them. But I'm interested to see whether they line up with yours, and then we can talk about how you actually get them done. But in terms of getting those emissions reductions, I think of four pillars: power, transport, methane from oil and gas, and agriculture. And they serve different functions. So I'll say what I mean. First, the power. If you're going to get to 50% below or 52% below 2005 by 2030 in the US, you don't do that without deep reductions in the power sector. That's where the tons are in the next decade. Almost all of the modeling I've seen, I should say, shows that to get to 50% below economy wide, you need it to be in the range of 75 to 85% or more just in the power sector, reducing emissions in the power sector. So that's number one, a deep cut in the power sector. The good news is the power sector is 40% below last year, 2005 levels. So there's a lot of progress that's been made. It won't happen by itself. We should talk about that. You need to accelerate the trends underway. We're going to need policies in place. We can talk about that. But that's the first area where you really get the tons, is the power sector. Second area is the transportation sector, which is now actually the biggest source of emissions in the United States, edging out power, largely because we've got those cuts in power I mentioned. I talk about transportation as like where the tons are by mid-century. So if we're going to get to net zero emissions by mid-century, which is the president's long-term goal, you can't do that without getting carbon out of the transport sector, and largely by electrifying cars and trucks, and then maybe other zero-emitting technologies like hydrogen. So but to do that by 2050, you need to start today, because the power sector, you can build wind and solar plants. I don't mean to minimize the investment required, but you can basically build that generation. You can plug it up to the grid. We can retire the coal plants. You can get that done in a decade. For the transportation sector, it's going to take longer. We've got to retool the factories. We got to get new models into the market, and then of course the old cars are going to be around for a while. So I think the target for the transport sector is get the zero emissions vehicles for cars by 2035, at least 100% sales by 2035, and 100% sales of zero emissions trucks by 2040. If you do that, you still get a pretty good, a couple 100 million tons of reductions by 2030, but that's a longer process. Third area, methane from oil and gas. Just very quickly, folks know, and we can go into this in more detail, but methane is the super pollutant that matters most, right? 120 times roughly more potent than CO2 when it's emitted, but it degrades more quickly within a decade or two, so that over a 20-year period, methane is about 84 times as potent as CO2. If we think about CO2 as the dial we have to control long-term warming and where the temperature ends up, methane is the dial we have to control the rate of warming over the coming decades. And controlling methane is the most important thing we can do to reduce that rate of warming. And in the US and in much of the world, the oil and gas sector is where we can get those methane reductions. So that means regulations, that means capping wells. Again, we can talk about that. Finally, the agricultural sector, not so much where the tons are, and this is something I really loved. I know Nicholas Institute's done a lot of work on this generally, but not so much where the tons are, but that's where the politics are. So if you think about how we are going to build back some bipartisan or have any hope of building bipartisan support for action on climate in Congress, I think it's going to start with agriculture. Ironically, this week, Senators Stabenow and Boozman reintroduced the Growing Climate Solutions Act, which is a bipartisan bill about dealing with, helping agriculture and land use be part of the climate solution. So those, I think, are the four areas. Obviously, a lot to unpack in terms of how we get there. I'm curious about whether does your take match that, or there are other things that we've missed?
No, I think so. When I'm asked this question, I think you and I both have had to sort of spend a lot of time answering this question in the last couple of weeks. I usually think of three planks, but all of what you said is included mostly in one plank. I think of, the Biden agenda is really, one is the whole of government approach that you and I work very hard on, that really does seem to have taken hold. And that means things you can't model that may have effect, like risk disclosure from the SEC, like being able to settle cases from the Justice Department so that you can get greenhouse gas reductions, but looking under all the authority and all the influence that the federal government has on our society and our economy to try and move everything towards decarbonization. Second thing I would always talk about is the investment agenda. It's clear the one thing that this administration thinks they can get through Congress with significant benefit on greenhouse gases is going to be a investment agenda. A $2 trillion package that's proposed that's going to spend a lot of money. I'm really lowering the cost of the transition you're describing. Let's build the grid that helps us bring with public money that helps us bring the power to the load centers. Let's create the charging stations to reduce the range anxiety so people will purchase the cars. Those sorts of things. And then third is this regulatory agenda and looking at what levers the administration has to influence those three of those four big items you say: the power sector, the cars and vehicles, and the methane leaks, particularly from the oil and gas sector. So maybe drilling down a little bit on, and I have a couple of good questions coming through in the chat here, Matt, but before we get to there, maybe drilling down a little bit more on what you can do on those three big sectors, or your four big sectors. What is it that Biden can do to get the power sector on that pathway to 2035? Maybe we start there. Is that a regulatory program? Do you have hopes for a clean energy standard through Congress? How does the politics work on that? So what can we expect that actually can clean that power sector at the pace you're describing and hoping for so we can meet this NDC?
Yeah, I think that's the right place to start. So, look, if we're going to do it, I mean, I think there are multiple tools that can be used, and they all need to be used. I mean, one of the themes, I love the whole of government approach. You and I have been talking about that and helping to get that into the bloodstream. And one example, a different take on that is you've got to use all the tools you have. Different sort of interpretation of that, which is entirely consistent. You also have to use all the tools you have. You've got to use regulatory tools, you've got to use infrastructure investment, and ultimately we're going to need legislation. So I think for the power sector, and almost for everything, it starts with the infrastructure package that Congress is likely to pass this summer. It's already in play. The president has already proposed the American Jobs Act from his point of view. Obviously, Congress is working hard at this now. I think that will be, that'll be key across all the areas I mentioned. But in the case of power sector, you can imagine significant investments in a cleaner grid, in transmission and distribution infrastructure, also some related authorities to FERC that would allow for the construction of long distance transmission lines. There are a whole set of things you can do that are clearly, straight up infrastructure. And so that would be a really important step on its own, in addition to a set of tax credits and clean energy tax credits. Senator Wyden just introduced that earlier this week, his bill to overhaul and really streamline and ramp up the clean energy tax credit system. So all of that, I think, fits within the traditional four walls of an infrastructure bill. I think the key thing is you also need from my point of view, you need something that puts an enforceable limit on carbon pollution from the sector. If we're going to get to 80% below, we can't do it just by throwing money at it. We can't do it just through tax credits, I don't think. I think we're going to need to put in place the policy certainty and the structure that allows utilities to make the investments they need to get those deep cuts in carbon. When people talk about a clean electricity standard, that's what I have in mind. The president's talked about that, but he's kept it pretty high level. I think there are lots of ways to design a clean electricity standard, but in my view, the common theme has to be there's a standard. There's a standard that you have to meet that represents an enforceable limit of some way on pollution. And I think one of the big questions that a lot of people are working on is, can you get that sort of standard or something that functions like it in an infrastructure investment package if you need to go through reconciliation with only the 50 Democratic votes? A lot of smart people who say they think they can do it. I think that's going to be a big push. If it turns out you can't do a standard through reconciliation, I think you have to keep pushing on it through regular order. It sounds like a heavy lift. It is a heavy lift, but we can't let Congress off the hook from acting on this. And we're going to need more than just the infrastructure spending, although that's going to be critical to getting to that 50%. The third leg of the stool, I mentioned infrastructure, I mentioned legislation like the Clean Electricity Standard. The third leg is going to be regulatory approaches. The Clean Air Act provides the Environmental Protection Agency with real authority, not just on carbon pollution, but also on health based pollutants more, or on health harming pollutants more broadly. There is lots of scope for EPA to update mercury rules on interstate pollution that crosses state lines, and to do that in a way that really cleans up the air, especially for disadvantaged and minority and low-income communities that have borne the brunt of pollution throughout the sort of the past several decades. It's time that we give everybody clean air, and I think one big way to do that is to use the authorities under the Clean Air Act to do that, and that will also have an impact on burning coal, which is one of the biggest contributors still in terms of fossil fuels in the electric power industry. So I think there are multiple pathways here in terms of making progress in the power sector.
So let's stay here in power just for one more minute. One of the questions in the chat was, what is credible for the administration to claim it can do on its own, and what does it need Congress to do? And I think, as you put your finger on it, there'll be a lot of interest in a clean energy standard of some sort going through Congress. There are a lot of smart people working on it. If it's unachievable politically because it can't be done through reconciliation and it's a lift, how much can be done with the EPA authority? How much? And I'll just say one more thing on that. The day before the president was inaugurated, the D.C. Circuit, the second highest court in the land, reviewed the Trump administration's rule on power plants and greenhouse gases, struck down the reading of the rule, the one that said that you only can look at things that were within the fence line of the plant, and kind of re-invited the administration to look back to the Clean Power Plan that the Obama administration wrote and think about that rationale in terms of how to set standards and like. However, you also have a 6-3 Supreme Court now with people like Justice Kavanaugh, who were pretty vociferously opposed to that reading of the act when it was argued in 2015 or 16. That would undoubtedly review that statute. So how aggressive could Biden be with his greenhouse gas authorities, given that he's been invited to revisit the Clean Power Plan logic, which also had the carbon, invitation for carbon markets by the states and a lot of sort of interesting flexibility, but also, he doesn't want to invest 3 years in a rulemaking that will just be struck down by the Supreme Court. How much can we expect out of that?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll share a couple of thoughts, and you've thought a lot about this. You're actually the lawyer here, right? I'm just the economist, so you'll probably have a better sense. But I will say, first of all, one thing just to say right off the bat, and it's the DC Circuit case you mentioned is a good example of this. There's a common misperception that Trump was successful in rolling back all the EPA regulations and the health-based regulations that the Obama administration put in place. And that's simply false. I mean, that is not correct. He tried to do that, but he was totally incompetent. And his government, his EPA, from everybody from the White House. I worked in the White House on the, overseeing a lot of the regulations working on the regulations in the Obama era. I know pretty detailed way how that gets done and what good government looks like. And the Trump administration was just incompetent. And that was one of the saving graces for those of us who care about protecting health and protecting the environment and protecting human welfare, because they were spectacularly unsuccessful in their court cases. And that was due partly to their incompetence and bungling, but also in large part to colleagues of mine and yours and folks we know throughout the environmental community and the academic legal community who really were able to defend and litigate and defend the statutory authorities in the Clean Air Act, as well as many of the regulations. So I want to start because the Trump administration lost something like 90% of its cases, and it's just important to recognize that we lost 4 years where we could have, it was a missing 4 years where we could have made much more progress, but they didn't succeed in rolling a lot back. Having said that, the Supreme Court looks different, as you said, than it did a few years ago. That's a whole different story, but it does look different. And with Justice Kavanaugh as as a deciding vote there, it looks a lot harder. And so I do think you need to take that into account, and the administration will take that into account. But look, there are lots. I mean, the EPA has been regulating pollution for 50 years, right? And there is a very long and very solid track record, both in the power plants and in transportation. So I think there's a lot to go on in terms of really robust regulatory authority. But I think this would probably not be. Well, let me put it this way: I think the administration and EPA, Michael Regan, who used to be at Environmental Defense Fund as a former colleague, Administrator Regan, I think they will be appropriately thoughtful about how they construct the design of clean air standards with legal resilience and robustness in mind. And so there's a lot of thinking going on about that. I guess the overall answer, to come back to the big picture that was introduced in the chat, you can't get all the way you need to go in the power sector just through regulation. Even if you had a sort of free hand in the Supreme Court, you'd probably still be limited in getting all the way to 80% below. So I do think you're going to need all the tools. As I said, you need big investment in the infrastructure package. You need regulatory standards that can start the process and make sure that we're protecting human health. And you need, I think, ultimately we'll need legislation in addition to that, not to get started, but I do think we'll need legislation to get all the way we need to get to by the end of the year. But I mean, by the end of the decade. But I'm curious whether you have a different read on the Supreme Court or on the Clean Air Act regulations.
Not. I think you've described it well. I think there's reason to be very judicious in how the agency approaches it. Like you said, I think that I observed the arguments with then Judge Kavanaugh. I think there's even precedential value that I think you could see in terms of his own judicial philosophy of minimizing discretion to the executive in some ways that that runs a risk. However, the market and the technology available has changed a lot for the power sector since the Clean Power Plan was written, and the language for rulemaking under Section 111D, which is used, has always been the best system of emissions reduction, and there have been a lot of better systems of emissions reductions developed since that plan was written. So I think there's probably some truly defensible ways to push the sector through the greenhouse gas regulations, and still yet stay within kind of the bounds of what is more likely to survive a Supreme Court review. That said, I think it won't get us to 80% reduction. It won't get those reductions you've identified that we need, and we need to be able to work with Congress. And that kind of gets to another question in the chat, because if you can't do a CES through a reconciliation bill, and I would note, even if you could, do you have 50 votes in the Senate for it? Do you have all Democrats? And even if you could do that, would it be a durable standard that wouldn't just be flipped again through the next budget reconciliation bill passed by a Republican Senate? So if you can't do that through a reconciliation bill, you have to rebuild you have to get to 60. You have to get to some bipartisanship on this. And you, I think, proposed earlier and correctly that rural America and the agricultural sort of interests are a good way to begin that conversation in the U.S. political world. And Don McCabe asked a question saying that, a minute ago you had said that the politics of agriculture can be solved with revenue for farmers for carbon markets and non-regulatory approach. Or actually, no, that's not from you, but he cited from having said recently. How, if that's true and voluntary markets are going to be a driver, he's asking also, how does that transfer over into the NDC and our ability to achieve those targets? Can that actually not only be part of the political push, but also part of how we hit 50 to 52%?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I'll unpack it a little bit. And I know you've probably got some thoughts as well from the work that you all have done. I think, so first of all, just in terms to set the sort of political context here. I mentioned the Growing Climate Solutions Act this year, co-sponsored and introduced by Senator Stabenow, the chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee, and Senator Bozeman, the ranking member. And it's really interesting, actually, if you think, back to when you and I were working on this stuff. You were in the Senate staff, and I was back at EDF at an earlier time. Ag actually was a hurdle, right? When we were thinking about legislation back in sort of 2007 to 2010 period. And so it's very interesting, I think, to have seen the politics kind of transform. And I think that's a response to a couple of things. First of all, in the intervening decade plus, we've seen what climate impacts mean for rural America and for agriculture in particular. We've seen droughts and flooding and just a general shift in temperatures and climate that is unprecedented. And so I think farmers are realizing, whether or not you want to call it climate change for them, they're realizing that something's going on, and they need to, they're looking for ways to become more resilient. At the same time, there are opportunities there. We have a much better understanding, although I would argue we still need to learn much more about the science to be precise, but we have a better understanding about the potential for agricultural soils, ranch, pasture land and forest soils to contain carbon, and how to manage those lands in order to increase carbon storage, sequestration out of the atmosphere and storage. So that means, there's an opening for farmers and ranchers and forest owners to be part of the solution as well. So I think the confluence of those two things is partly why we are seeing we're seeing land use as a potential bipartisan approach. Actually, EDF is part of a coalition, the Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance, which includes the American Farm Bureau. It includes the National Association of Forest Landowners. It includes other farm and rancher and forest groups. And I think that really represents, the new politics behind that, and the support behind it. The mention of the voluntary market or pathways, one of the cornerstones of the Growing Climate Solutions Act that was introduced earlier this week, would indeed be to help set up some of the infrastructure that could provide economic incentives for farmers who increased soil carbon in their soils. So as a way of providing an economic incentive for reduced emissions. I think it's a very powerful idea. I think it probably will look different this time than 10 years ago in the wax and market legislation, or 12 years ago when people were thinking about plugging that into some sort of compliance obligation. I think it probably looks different this time. One interesting idea, as you know, is the carbon bank being floated by, that Robert Bonney, your old colleague, my old colleague at EDF, also a former Nicholas Institute guy, has been talking about now. Secretary Vilsack's right-hand man at USDA. So maybe there's a way that, as part of that whole of government approach, that USDA can get into the action and think about a soil carbon bank that provided some of these economic incentives. So I think there's lots of ways to get farmers and other landowners into the action. With respect to the NDC, I haven't done actually the math in terms of the specific, what the magnitude would be, but clearly to get to 50 and 52%, we're going to need every ton we can get. And in previous analyses, I know that land use has been a swing factor in terms of whether we can meet ambitious targets. So we are going to need every ton of emissions reductions and carbon storage that we can get from farmlands and pasture lands and forest lands if we're going to meet that target. So it's got to be part of the overall effort. But I'm curious about how you think about this, both in terms of, frankly, we've been talking about mitigation. Obviously, that's a key part of it, but also in terms of this other thing I mentioned, which is the resilience to climate impacts.
Yeah, and so I'll stay in mitigation for a sec, but then I definitely think want to take a moment to focus on the resilience need that we have as well. And the Biden administration has declared an interest in also creating a whole of government approach and really focusing on making sure that our needs to plan for resilience to the climate effects also are incorporated throughout the government. But thinking about the mitigation, I was intrigued by Don's question because in all those modeling runs you identified, I don't think we ever really, I remember ever seeing anybody projecting a voluntary market move the needle on greenhouse gas. But I think it could be a very powerful factor in this. We did a lot of work, as you mentioned, on rural solutions at the Nicholas Institute on climate change. Did a lot of work on the rural attitudes and how to speak with farmers and ranchers about these issues. And I think there's a real ability to expand interest in these projects there. Not really talking about the theme of climate change but more on stewardship and soil carbon and the like, and the introduction of payment systems. The other thing I think that we really need to do to scale up, and again, this is work and conversations we've had with people like Robert Bonney, who identified, is just the amount of demonstration and conversation with people in those communities. Right now, the NRCS, the Extension Services of the Agriculture Department, are kind of eviscerated. They need the human capital to actually get out there, but the amount of interest and resources USDA looks to be putting into not only creating a carbon bank type of concept that would create payments, but to get out onto the land and educate people who are stewarding the land on how to mitigate carbon, I think could really bring benefits. For those who are investors in soil carbon and are listening to the call, I think you may have a government partner in educating the landowners that could be kind of the feedstock of your product. I also am glad you brought up resilience. One other project that we've been working on is called the Resilience Roadmap. This trying to take sort of the same logic that we had in our Climate 21 report. How does the whole of government work to activate itself to get the country ahead of its resilience needs? I mean, we're reminded of this every day through the polar vortex freezing the Texas grid, or a storm raging across the West. We're kind of reminded when it's very acute and it's happening, and the government is really more of a reactionary force on a lot of these things. And so we're trying to introduce the concepts of creating a national resilience strategy headed by somebody within the White House who kind of owns that brief, and have a proactive planning capability so that we don't build any of this infrastructure we're going to build from here to 2050. None of it should be built in a way that's not resilient to the known risks of climate change. And that sort of planning capacity should be infused within the government. Let me look at another question in the chat, Nat. Question from Tyler Van Leeuwen a few seconds ago. Is there a concern that carbon bank policy will limit private investment in development projects by challenging the additionality? Something you know well, I know well, the additionality metric. And if there's going to be an ability for a government payment for these projects, do they no longer have the prospect of being able to be credited in these voluntary markets that we talk about might motivate movement in the sector, and also might motivate political interest in the sector?
That's a really interesting question. And so let me preface that what I'm about to say is, I'm just going to be riffing a little bit and speculating, because I don't mean to say what I'm going to say is suggestive of how the USDA is thinking about a carbon bank or anything else. But it strikes me that a natural approach here, right, would be to think about the government as a backstop, as a kind of price guarantee, as setting a price guarantee or price floor, but one above which voluntary market purchases or private investors could come in. So in other words, you'd like to see the government crowding in investment and giving landowners, farmers, and so on the guarantee they need to make the upfront investments to change the practices and so on that will start storing the carbon, but not to get in the way of private sector investment that might want to come in. So I would think of it as, and again, I have no idea if this is how folks are thinking about the actual implementation of the carbon bank, but provide it as a way of, here's offer a price guarantee, price floor of some sort for proven, verified emissions reductions. But again, use it as a price floor, and then that could provide the guarantee that landowners need without getting in the way of private investment. That's actually a that's an approach we've used in other settings. That are more of an international setting, but it's one I think you could apply in this case.
I'm also thinking of it actively and but in real time here. But in those other settings, what has the additionality analysis been done? So let's just say you had a floor of X. You can get Y in the private market, but you still know that the farmer was going to do the project to receive the floor price. Could you argue that the private investment didn't create any additional reductions? And has that been thought through in these other markets that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, this gets into an interesting question that probably the audience knows much more than I do about this question of how you think about financial additionality versus,
Right.
tons additionality, if you will. My own view is we should be focused on additionality into the atmosphere in terms of practices and measures that are happening that wouldn't have happened under regulation or wouldn't have happened under sort of business as usual. But I would think, it's an interesting question, but I would think it would be a little perverse if, somehow let's say you set just to use round numbers, let's say you set a price floor of $10 a ton, and that the government said, we stand ready. You had a carbon bank that said, we stand ready to buy and retire soil carbon emissions reductions at $10 a ton. But hey, if you find somebody who's willing to pay 12 or 15, go for it. That it would be perverse if that then got penalized for the $10 a ton. In the setting we've used, which has been in the tropical forest setting, the additionality, the standard, it really focuses on the additionality with respect to tons and historical baselines and so on. And so there's not a financial additionality test in that case, and I don't think, frankly, there should be. That's a deeper philosophical question going forward. But I think in the context of the U.S., if we were thinking about voluntary markets that were, that could provide a real incentive for farmers and landowners to store and sequester carbon, I think applying some sort of financial additionality test would be probably the wrong direction. We just want to make sure that was real and verified emissions reductions, and not worry too much about the financial additionality of it relative, especially to some soil carbon bank. But again, I'm just talking off the cuff. So there are a lot of people on this call
I'm
who
going to
probably
pull
know
us
much
back
more
out of
than
it.
I do.
Yeah, I'm going to pull us back out of additionality conversation before we lose our audience too far. But you brought up tropical forests. I actually want to, I think we have like 12 minutes left. I do want to circle back to a couple of our major planks, the cars and the methane. We haven't really touched on those for we can get, real gains to meet the NDC. But tropical forest, EDF has part of a big announcement on tropical forests in this crazy week we've had as well. I think that would be very interesting to make sure that everybody knows about. So I'm going to give you like a free microphone to make sure that the audience knows
I think it would
about
be great. Thanks, and then we can go back. Yeah. So EDF has worked with many others, right, for a long time on tropical forest protection and thinking about models of financing tropical forest protection at scale. And yesterday, the announcement of the LEAF coalition. LEAF stands for lowering emissions by accelerating forest finance. There are actually two F's, but we only leave one of them in the acronym. So it's the LEAF coalition. It was US, UK, and Norway, along with 9 companies headlined by Amazon, also including Unilever and Salesforce and others. And the collective commitment is $1 billion in finance for large-scale jurisdictional tropical forest protection, with at least half of that coming from the private companies involved. That's the biggest private sector investment we've ever seen in tropical forest protection at scale. It uses the trees standard under the Architecture for Red transaction, so it's really super high quality standard that's been put in place for jurisdictional emissions reductions at the scale of entire countries or states or provinces. And then it uses the Emergent Forest Finance Accelerator, the forest, which is a facility that is built to do transactions of those jurisdictional emissions reductions. So from my mind, as somebody who's been working on tropical forest and at an organization that's been working on tropical forest protection for a long time, this is a huge milestone and a potential game changer in really unlocking private finance at scale into tropical forest protection. If we don't protect the tropical forest, we have no hope of keeping temperature under 2 degrees. And we also need, tropical forests to sustain indigenous peoples and forest communities. So big news actually coming out of the summit yesterday, and it'll be exciting to see how that works going forward. So thanks for giving me the mic.
Yeah, great. We have really good questions coming in here. So I'm going to try and do a little bit of a speed round on methane and vehicles, and then get to a couple of questions. On methane, let me sort of express a concern. So the first day one executive order out of the president said that the methane rule need to be revisited and reestablished in all likelihood by September. However, there's also a push right now, I think it's queued up for a vote next week, on the Congressional Review Act to disapprove of the Trump rule. And I wanted to sort of talk about how we're going to get to, you think we should best get to an effective rule controlling our methane emissions from oil and gas. But I particularly want to speak to the risk of the Congressional Review Act and whether that actually might create some trouble, because once you disapprove of a rule on the Congressional Review Act, you're not supposed to write a similar rule. So how does Biden make sure he doesn't box himself out from having the authority to write a stronger rule?
So I think it's the key issue around, what does substantially similar mean, right? And I think folks are aware of this, right? And it's on the radar. But I also think it's worth the step to take to push forward with the methane CRA to get rid of that old Trump rule, because it effectively clears out that it clears that old rule off the books and makes it much easier to put something in place that's going to actually do the job. So, folks are aware of that, but it's not something that, once you do that, you can't do anything on methane. It's just the substantially similar test. And I think folks are pretty comfortable with that. I do think methane is going to be a critical, it's going to be a critical focus of this administration. And it should be, as I mentioned, it's the one way we have to slow down warming in the near term. The Obama administration put in place significant methane and really well-designed methane rules on new oil and gas facilities. And so what needs to happen now is to strengthen those, but also extend them to existing facilities, as well as taking advantage in this sort of whole of government approach, putting back in place standards for oil, for activities that happen on public lands, for example. So I think that ought to be a top priority.
Think we'll have a new rule by September on
Yes.
oil and gas?
I do.
Right.
I think the administrator is very focused on it.
Okay. And then on the vehicles, I think vehicles, at least the cars at this point, it seems pretty clear what the path is going to be. So let me comment on it, and then you can sort of object or critique what I say. Unless something's come across Twitter that I haven't seen, we're expecting a ruling on the California waiver. California's authority to be well established by the time this month's over. Probably a interim rule. It did come through?
I think it came through yesterday, yeah. But
all right. Well, with forgiveness to all the Californians in the crowd, it's been a busy day. But then we are also going to expect an interim rule in July. But I think then the most important thing is that won't be the end of the story for this administration. I think then they'll immediately turn and really look at what they can do in terms of a next generation rule, next generation technology that can encourage the president's push for the EVs and for that change over the fleet that you talked about in your so that by 2050 we're hitting the targets he wants to see. But that would you agree with that characterization? What we're expecting on the vehicle fleet?
Yeah, I think that's right. And then I would go a little bit further in saying a couple of things. One is on cars, light duty vehicles. Actually, on both sides. So actually, let me flip that with the order, because let me start by saying I think the White House is maybe a little bit too focused on cars. This is one place where we'd like to see them go further. We think there's an opportunity to do medium and heavy duty trucks alongside light duty vehicles like cars. We think I think folks in the agency see the logic of that. We have we've got allies, I think, in the manufacturing and the engine manufacturers who also see the benefit of that. And one of the big things that you get if you clean up truck pollution and you get trucks on the path to zero emitting trucks, you also get a huge boost in terms of much cleaner air, especially in disadvantaged frontline communities, because the diesel truck pollution is really hitting some of the poor neighborhoods that line the highways and the boulevard, and the major arteries. So we think in addition to being a big greenhouse gas story here, there's also an important equity and clean air story here. And so we think that trucks ought to be a real priority alongside light duty vehicles. Now, in both of those cases, the other thing I would say is you look at the whole totality of pollution. I mean, when you talk about tailpipe emissions, you're talking about particulate matter. You're also talking about nitrous oxide. You're not just talking about carbon emissions, and we ought to have tailpipe emissions that take all of that into account. This is something EPA has been doing for 50 years. And so we think, the pathway here is very durable, very robust. Standards to get to zero emitting vehicles for health, to reduce health harming pollutants, as well as greenhouse gases. And so I think that's a pathway that gets you to zero emitting vehicles. And then alongside that, really briefly, there's a really important role for infrastructure investment, because we need to be making sure, and I think Congress understands this, we're investing in domestic manufacturing of electric vehicles, domestic manufacturing of batteries, the whole supply chain, so that we continue to produce vehicles here in the U.S. We're producing electric vehicles of the future rather than the previous generation of internal combustion engine.
Yeah. Your equity comments, and the questions are coming into me, so I'm sort of taking the moderator's microphone, but we can feel free to bounce these back and forth as much as you want. As Santosh Shankar wrote, what will the role of market-based mechanisms be for emission reductions, especially in power industrial? This is a fun question to ask EDF, and and he carries the critique that the mechanisms have been demonstrated in their efficiency, but they face strong opposition from equity and environmental justice communities. So, it used to be like when you and I were working very hard on these proposals about a decade ago, it was mostly a right flank concern in terms of this. There is actually now political challenges on both sides that need to be addressed. And so, what do you see for the role for these sorts of mechanisms, and how can they adequately address the concerns that are coming from the justice communities?
Yeah. So, I mean, I know we're sort of in a lightning round. I will just say quickly, I think those are so closely related, because if we are going to get new kind of market-based mechanisms in place, they have to be designed to address inequities just in like the core of the design. It can't just be an afterthought or something on the side. Mm-hmm. I think in the power sector, something like a clean electricity standard, first of all, that will be the best way to go both guarantee the emissions reductions we need and give the flexibility and optionality to the power sector to figure out how to get there. And that's the hallmark of flexible approaches and market-based approaches. And you need to develop a clean electricity standard, and I think we know how to do this, and others do as well, like that builds in protections for local communities inside, guarantees improvement in air quality as part of that measure and as part of that policy. And then I think you've got some real promise. I will say right now, as we speak, Washington State is considering a cap and invest bill, and it's the first one that actually includes real provisions to address air quality as part of the design of that bill. So we know how we can do it. Similar, there were EJ provisions, equity and justice provisions built into the Colorado legislation as well. I think this is something we can do this synthesis, but we need to make sure that these equity provisions are built into the heart of the legislation and the heart of the policies.
Yeah, I'll just, in the lightning round, just agree with that. We do know how to do it. I think the other thing is it needs to be written in partnership with those communities so they know and trust that the provisions are being put in. But I think the successes you're pointing to, or the hopeful successes in some of these states, can provide some really natural pilots and can lead to some trust. I'm going to ask one more question, and I think we're going to be out of time. Just got this question that seems to be very apropos of what we just talked about. The federalism question. To what extent do state and local policies impact our overall climate ambition? What's the partnership like now? And do you think, and I'll note the U.S. Climate Alliance just came out with a whole list of update for all those 25 states targets to now meet the new Paris ambitions. But what do you think the state's role is in hitting those targets? And I'll say one last thing. I'll start answering the question and say they'll have a very big role in this. This isn't a decade ago when we thought the feds would preempt everything. The states have been incredible partners, incredible leaders, and I think a lot of what we'll see will be very cooperative between the levels of government, both in the spending package, many of those programs flow through the states, and in sort of the execution of the programs. But let me let you take that on here.
Yeah, no, I mean,
I think will be our last question.
Yeah, I'm just going to agree largely with what you said, Tim, and tie it back to something we were talking about earlier, which is the question about credibility and durability, right? So over the past 4 years, when Trump was trying to take us backwards and take us out of everything internationally and move backwards on climate, it was the states, along with the cities and companies, but especially the states and cities, that really held everything together and kept us moving forward. And I think you're right. That role, we're not going to move backwards from that. And we shouldn't. The states can be enormous partners in this. And so I think the model of federalism we're going to need is one in which preserves the state's ability to lead where they're willing, but also has, this is a national issue. It's an international issue. So we can't get there all the way just relying on the states. So it's that balance of having the federal government needs to act, has a responsibility to act, and should preserve the room for states to take on leadership, but also to learn from the states. I mean, I mentioned Washington, which is in the process, of considering at least the cap and invest bill that would be a new model. You've got California that's been a leader on tailpipe emissions and vehicles. You've got Colorado leading the way, utilities like Xcel leading the way in terms of ambition in the power sector. So I think there's a lot to learn from the states that can be imported into the Washington discussion, but we will need something in Washington if we're going to get back to that 50, if we're going to achieve that 50% that we mentioned. That's going to need action from Washington for sure.
That's great, and this hour has flown by, Nat. I really appreciate the conversation and the exploration. I hope it was helpful for everybody who's watching, and thank you for taking the time to listen.
Yeah, thanks to everybody on board, and thanks to you, Tim. It was a lot of fun conversation. Thanks to the organizers for the event as well.
Take care, everybody. Enjoy the conference.